And when you think about behavioral addictions, it's not just the nature of the rewarding behavior. It's potentially addictive because it activates the reward pathway in the brain or the reward circuitry. But it's the combination of being rewarding and the interaction with a susceptible or a vulnerable individual. So not everyone who games is going to have a gaming addiction, but for some individuals, particularly with some risk factors, they may be more likely to develop a behavioral addiction than others. So it's really the combination of becoming aware of the potential for addiction among these behaviors, but then also being aware of the risk factors that make certain individuals more susceptible or vulnerable than others. So it's a little bit more complex, I think, than we give credit to, that there are some layers to think about.
That is Dr. Amanda Giordano, and this is the Well Mind Podcast. The Well Mind is a space for meaningful conversations about a broad range of wellness-related topics, with a special emphasis on our mental wellness. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Coles. Welcome to the podcast for any and all newcomers, and welcome back to all of you faithful listeners. I recently read an article in Counseling Today. It was entitled 6 Steps for Addressing Behavioral Addictions in Clinical Work. And upon finishing the article, I knew immediately I needed to invite the author onto the podcast. Fast forward a few short weeks, and I was able to sit down with Dr. Amanda Giordano and talk all about her work in the field of behavioral addiction. So you may ask, what is a behavioral addiction? Well, most folks recognize gambling, both in person and online, as a behavioral addiction. But Amanda sheds light on this topic as we discuss internet gaming, social media, pornography, sex, food, and a whole host of other behaviors where addiction can be manifest. We talk about the difference between high engagement and addiction, the importance of education and early intervention in this area, especially in our school system, how families with kids and teens can address potential behavioral addictions, and what recovery from a behavior addiction looks like. And honestly, frankly, way more than I could possibly include in this intro. Amanda is an amazing guest. She is so passionate about her field and wants to raise awareness and educate people about this critical issue. She recently published a book of encyclopedic information on the topic of behavioral addictions for professionals doing clinical work. In the process of writing that book, she interviewed numerous experts in all the various fields of behavioral addiction and has been sharing that knowledge through regular articles in Psychology Today. Look it up in the show notes. There's links. I guarantee your knowledge and understanding of this topic is going to get a massive infusion of information as you listen to our conversation. So here we go. My chat with Amanda in episode 29, Facing Behavioral Addiction. Well, welcome, Amanda. It's wonderful to have you on the Well Mind podcast. I've been looking forward to our conversation, and I think this is we're going to cover some new topics that I have not addressed yet on the podcast, so I'm really excited about that, but just thrilled to be able to connect with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited about the conversation as well.
Good. So let's just start with some introductions, help our audience get to know you a little bit. Amanda, tell us about kind of where you're at, what you're up to, some background stuff, personally, professionally, whatever you think is good for us to know about you.
Yeah, sure. So Amanda Giordano, and I am an associate professor at the University of Georgia. I specialize in addictions counseling. That's where I do most of my teaching and research, and community engagement is all around trying to raise awareness about addiction. This year has been kind of fun. I had my first book come out, and it was on treating behavioral addictions, and that was such a fulfilling and rewarding process to write that book and interview clinicians and members of 12-step programs in order to really understand what it's like to work with behavioral addictions in clinical practice. And so, I've been in Georgia. This is my 4th year here on faculty, but I also did my undergrad here. So I'm kind of an obnoxious Bulldog fan as well.
All right.
And so we're having a great season right now.
That's
so
cool. That's
loving
cool.
it.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Are you able to get out and go to the games?
Yes.
Yes.
I am. Yeah. One of the amazing perks of being a UGA faculty member is you can enter into the faculty lottery for tickets. So this is my first year with them.
Wow. That's so cool. Confession, I've never been to like a Division I college football game. I've always wanted to go. I mean, the atmosphere, the crowd, like the whole experience. I've been to some professional football games and those are fantastic, but I just think the college experience has got to be a little bit different.
Yes, I'm so biased, but I just don't think anything compares to the traditions of a UGA football game. It's just amazing. So I could go on and on about that, but I love it. Sure. Between the hedges, there's nothing like it.
Okay. All right. I love it. That's great. So I hear a sense in your accent that you have some Southern roots, maybe. So it's not just being in Georgia for school and work.
Right.
So what's your background?
Yeah, so I was raised in Augusta, Georgia. So if people care about golf, we were raised with the Masters golf tournament right there. And so spent the majority of my life in Georgia. I went to North Carolina for my master's and PhD and then got my first job in Texas. And I was there for 6 years, but now kind of back home in Georgia. I've never played golf, but I feel like if I did, I'd probably be really good at it because I watch a lot of it. And that's obviously how it works. If you just watch it enough, you end up being good at it. So love watching golf. Yep.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Do you know, I mean, there are so many counseling programs in Texas. Do you know why that is? I haven't figured that out yet. There just seems to be such an abundance.
Oh yeah. And they're great programs. I mean, I think it's
really, yes.
A huge state, so they have a lot of space for lots of different programs, but they have a great university system there. And some of the leaders of our field are in Texas schools. So a great program there. The Texas Counseling Association is huge and they're doing a lot of great work. So it's just very vibrant there. Yeah.
My clinical supervisor, so I worked and lived in Florida for a while. And my clinical supervisor was a faculty at University of South Florida, but she went to Texas. So she's in Denton and she's a play therapist and faculty there. And so it just seems like so many careers and pathways, circle through Texas at some point. I have not, but so I'm on the outside, I guess.
Well, it's wonderful. I loved my time in Texas. I think there are great schools there. And I think there's amazing programs and leaders coming out of those schools.
Awesome. So at what point, because the counseling field is pretty broad, you can do a lot of different things in the counseling field. And working in addictions is certainly a good section of that field. But what drew you to that particular specialty area? Yeah,
it was a little bit serendipitous, I guess you could say. I think it was part of how my life was planned out and how it was supposed to go. But when I was in my doc program, we got an email saying that our funding had been cut a little bit because of what was going on in the economy. And so I was like, I need a part-time job so that I can keep my apartment. And so I just started to applying to restaurants to be a server somewhere while I was full-time in school. And I got hired at this Italian restaurant, and I'm sure it was just because of my last name. They thought, oh, she must know what she's doing, in Italian. And so I worked at that restaurant for a year and a half, and I was just exposed to firsthand folks who were using substances and were addicted to those substances and wanted to stop, but were unable to. And addiction runs in my extended family, but I have been pretty protected from it growing up. My parents just tried to limit our exposure to family or even, extended family that were struggling with addiction. And so I didn't have a real clear sense of of what addiction entailed until I started working at this restaurant and really got to be close friends with a lot of these people and heard their stories and heard how, they kind of stumbled into substance use as a means to regulate emotions and cope with life's difficulties. And then it kind of spiraled out of control from there, and really wanting to stop, but again, not being successful. And it just dawned on me. I was like, I don't know how to help these people. Like, I don't even know how to conceptualize what they're dealing with. And so that was at the very start of my doc program. And I decided I'm going to, change my emphasis. And so I co-taught the addictions class. I changed my dissertation to be around addictions, and just learned as much as I could while I was in the program. And then since then, so I guess for the last decade now, that's been my focus in terms of research and teaching.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's so interesting, because we oftentimes have these influences on our career, and they come from completely unexpected places. I mean, you weren't working at the Italian restaurant to get clarity on a dissertation topic, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah.
But how life has this way of kind of bumping us along on the sides, and having these influences that spark our interest, or we see a need, and clearly you have a passion for helping people and providing education and support to people. And so there was this deep need that you saw in that community that you were in. But that's everywhere. I mean, there isn't a community in our country or the world that doesn't get touched by addiction.
Yes. And I definitely think that played a part even in getting my first job. So I was in Denton. I worked at the University of North Texas for 6 years. Okay. And part of that was they needed someone to teach an addictions class. So I do believe that, being at that restaurant really changed the trajectory of what I was going to study, but then even getting my first job. And now here at Georgia, that's my specialty area that I, teach, and have been able to, write some books, and all of that, I think, came from that one experience. So I tell my students all the time that their inspiration for what they want to study or what they end up becoming passionate about can come from anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. As long as you're open to it, right?
Yeah.
You have to be open to it. So disclosure here on my part, when I went to grad school, as we were going through the DSM and talking about all the different mental health issues, we had a section in that class covering substance use and abuse, and addiction. And then that was kind of it, right? It was pretty minimal. And I think that's somewhat dependent upon the state, because so I went to school here in Minnesota, and substance use counseling and mental health counseling have been very siloed and kept separate, and to the point where there's LADC here in Minnesota, licensed addiction and drug, or licensed alcohol and drug counselor, and then the LPC or LPCC, right, licensed professional, and it's like dual diagnosis programs have both of those people, so it's not one person working with a client, but it's two separate people working. And I think there's some advantages, disadvantages to that. But from an education standpoint, it feels like professional counselors ought to know a bit more about the world of addiction than what maybe we were initially getting. And then I went into my doc program, and I specialized more in psychopharmacology and addiction issues. And so I took some courses here and there outside of our department. But you know what? We never talked about?
What?
Behavioral
addictions, right?
Yeah, we never did. I mean, other than a mention of gambling, right? And everybody's kind of familiar with that. Like, oh yeah, that gambling's an addictive thing. There's lots of awareness, especially in different parts of the country where that's more prevalent. And I see that all the time. But the actual topic of behavioral addiction doesn't really get addressed. And because the professionals aren't getting educated on it, I think then there's a huge lag in the public being educated.
Sure. Yeah.
So how did you find your way into that narrow funnel, like in the addiction field, into specifically all the writing and work you've been doing on behavioral addiction?
Yeah. So your experience with learning maybe a course or two about addictions in your grad program, I think is very common. Unfortunately, I think that we're moving away from that. We're trying to do more as we start to realize that no matter what setting you work in, you are going to work with addiction. That's my first lecture in my addictions course every semester. I kind of play a game of like, name your setting, and I'm going to give you tons of stats about why you need to know about chemical addiction and behavioral addictions. And at Georgia, we have a school counseling master's program. And so just letting them know that first pornography exposure is between 11 and 12 right now, and that we have people who start their sports betting and they start their social media and they start gaming all in adolescence. Like, of course we need school counselors to be aware of these topics. And so I just wanted to kind of confirm, I think that we have seen that this is something that's lacking in counselor education, but like the KCREP standards say, we need to know about not only the etiology of chemical addiction, but also addictive behaviors. So we're definitely moving in the right direction. It's challenging when behavioral addictions are not recognized in the DSM, because I think some people are guided by what's in the DSM. But I did want to note there's some hope and promise there as well, because yes, gambling disorder is now in the substance and related addictive behaviors chapter. So it's really acknowledging, yes, gambling is seen as a behavioral addiction. It used to be impulse control, and now we have it in this chapter. But also in chapter 3 or section 3 of the DSM, which is conditions for further study, we have proposed diagnostic criteria for internet gaming disorder and also non-suicidal self-injury disorder, both of which can be considered behavioral addictions. And the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, they recognize not only gambling, but also gaming as an official code in their classifications. They also have compulsive sexual behavior disorder in an impulse control section. So although it's not used as much in the US, the ICD-11 is really recognizing gaming, gambling, sex. And so we're starting to see much more formal recognition of behavioral addictions. But what I've learned is even if we're not teaching it as much in counselor ed programs, or not teaching as much as I would hope or think is needed. When I interviewed clinicians for the book that I wrote, they all were learning on the job. Like, they knew this is really important. This is what's showing up in my office. So I've got to either go to continuing education, do some self-study, learn on the job. So we know it's important, and people are seeking out this information themselves. They're trying to learn. They're seeking out certifications like becoming a certified sex addiction therapist. And so there are things that are out there, but unfortunately, they're not as built into counselor ed programs yet.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. And it's no knock against, my grad programs or anything like that, because I'm teaching in a clinical mental health program, and there's so much that needs to get covered.
Yep.
And you'd think, in a 60 credit master's degree, you'd have ample time to cover everything.
I know.
You really don't. So I understand. And, approaching things from a dual diagnosis standpoint, understanding that substance use, behavioral addiction issues, and mental health, pretty much are co-occurring in nearly.
Oh yeah, there's so much overlap. Yeah. And even if you can't have, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's not. In my mind, it just can't be contained to one class. Like you touch on multiculturalism everywhere in all of your courses. I think just factoring in substance and behavioral addiction into the curriculum and other courses is important, and that's going to be helpful. But you're right, too. We can't come out of grad school with a specialty, and we have to continue to educate ourselves.
Right.
And that's the only way then that we're going to be able to educate others, which kind of brings us, to our conversation today of like, how can we provide some information today that's going to help people listening to understand, okay, what behavioral addiction is, and probably also what it isn't. You use a term in some of your writing called high involvement. as a distinction between addiction. And I wonder if you could flesh that out a little bit for us here.
Yeah. So I want to make clear that behavioral addictions, it's not synonymous with just high involvement in a behavior or even the number of times you engage in a behavior a day or a week. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind, because I think one of the criticisms of behavioral addictions is that, we're just going to start pathologizing everything and everything's going to become an addiction. And that is really not the case. When you look at what behavioral addictions are, it's much more than just time spent in a particular behavior or high involvement. I like to use the 4Cs model, which is 4 hallmarks of behavioral addictions, and they all start with C, so it's easy to remember. But if a behavior becomes compulsive, so individuals are engaging in the behavior almost just at an urge to do so at inopportune times or inappropriate times, but they have this urge to engage. If they have a loss of control over the behavior, meaning they're engaging in the behavior for longer than they intended or more frequently than they intended, they might set limits for themselves, but they're not able to keep those limits. They feel like they've lost control. The third C is consequences. So they continue to engage in this behavior despite negative consequences. And just like chemical addiction, behavioral addictions can have a range of negative consequences, everything from legal issues, financial issues, health issues, relational and family conflict. There's a lot of negative consequences that are associated with these behaviors as well. And then that brings us to the 4th C, which is craving or mental preoccupation. So these individuals, when they're not engaging in the behavior, they're craving it, they're thinking about it. They might be reflecting upon the last time they engaged in the behavior or fantasizing about the next time they're going to engage in the behavior. So they're really not able to be in the present moment because they are so mentally preoccupied with this behavior. That's become the most salient part of their life. So those are the 4 C's. Those are the hallmarks that we look for, which really distinguishes behavioral addictions from being a professional gamer or a professional athlete or someone who works long hours. All of those can indicate high involvement in a particular behavior. But when those 4 C's, compulsivity, loss of control, continued despite negative consequences, and craving or mental preoccupation are present, that's when we're really thinking about behavioral addictions.
Got it. That's really, really helpful and very clear to me as I think through this, because that was one of the thoughts as I was kind of preparing for our conversation was, labels and terms get kind of thrown around at times. Somebody might be called a workaholic, or, a shopaholic or something, and it's, like you said, somebody that works long hours, they're highly involved in their career or their job. Is that an addiction or, I don't know, is there just an imbalance in kind of how they're spending their time, which doesn't necessarily mean addiction, but how, like, of these 4 C's, would you say all 4 of them have to be present in some capacity in order for it to be an addiction?
Yeah, so I would say those are kind of the main markers. So they're all going to be there. But the one I typically start with clients or having conversations with folks is the continued despite negative consequences. Because if you love your job and you work a lot, or you're a professional gamer, or you're a professional athlete, or you do a lot of online shopping, you're typically not experiencing a lot of negative consequences from those behaviors, but then continuing to behave in the same exact way despite those negative consequences. So if there are negative consequences there, like people are greatly in debt, or they have stopped taking care of themselves in terms of personal hygiene and sleep because they're gaming all night long, if they are starting to have detrimental effects on their relationships and their health because they're working so much and they can't kind of ever turn work off to have a relationship outside of work. If they're starting to see see those negative consequences, then yeah, I would ask more to kind of see if those other C's are present. And then there are a lot of formal assessments for behavioral addictions that I have found not a lot of folks know about, but we have instruments that have strong psychometric properties for everything from gaming addiction to shopping addiction to urges for non-suicidal self-injury to love addiction. And it's all out there. So I think if someone was indicating the 4 C's, I might follow up with one of those formal assessments as well. I've used the sexual addiction screening test revised with a client in session, and it was very, very helpful to have some numbers to really indicate the high risk for his sex addiction. And so I think assessments can be extremely useful as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I say this to my students all the time too, is that any good intervention or treatment that you might provide is only going to be good if it's based on a thorough and comprehensive assessment. So it really starts with that. So there's, I like how you've kind of scaffolded this out, Amanda, for us, because, it's starting with a kind of checking in with yourself, or if you're concerned about a loved one, it's kind of checking in on that. And you have these 4 C's as a little, just some categories to kind of conceptualize where am I at, or where's my loved one at. Most of my career, a big focus for me has been working with children and adolescents. And so inevitably, gaming has been a topic of conversation in the family therapy room, for sure. And I think cell phones and social media are also probably more today in the last few years present in the family therapy room than they were even, 10 years ago or something like that. But I don't know that there's a question there yet, Amanda, but I'm kind of thinking about like families navigating some of these issues where parents want to set boundaries with their kids. They want to give them good guidance, but, also, like here at Bethany, we have a thriving esports team, and it's like one of the best in the nation. Those guys are spending a lot of time, practicing, training, gaming, and they have been. So it's like, I don't know. Help me out here with what I'm trying to get at.
I actually have 2 thoughts based on what you're saying. First of all, I just got some data back from school counselors, and we were asking high school counselors, what are the addictive behaviors that you're seeing in your schools, and how has COVID impacted them? And the large majority of the high school counselors said that internet gaming has gotten so much more problematic during COVID, which we can understand, right? There's a lot more time at home. Maybe there's less supervision and that kind of thing. But interestingly, the major concern out of the list of addictive behaviors we gave them to choose from that came out was social media addiction, and just saying how rampant that was in schools. And, with social media use comes cyberbullying and potential sexting and sharing nude photos, but then also sharing images of non-suicidal self-injury on social media platforms. So it's not just one thing. There's quite a bit that gets wrapped up into that. And so when I think about trying to just educate parents or caregivers and teachers and helping them become aware of the potential risk of behavioral addictions, I try to be careful to not, demonize all of these forms of technology, because they can do some amazing things. But we're also giving a lot of responsibility to adolescents who are still developing in terms of their prefrontal cortex and their cognitive abilities to kind of reason out good choices. And we're giving them these tools that can expose them to a variety of potentially addictive behaviors. And when you think about behavioral addictions, it's not just the nature of the rewarding behavior. It's potentially addictive because it activates the reward pathway in the brain or the reward circuitry. But it's the combination of being rewarding and the interaction with a susceptible or a vulnerable individual. So not everyone who games is going to have a gaming addiction, but for some individuals, particularly with some risk factors, they may be more likely to develop a behavioral addiction than others. So it's really the combination of becoming aware of the potential for addiction among these behaviors, but then also being aware of the risk factors that make certain individuals more susceptible or vulnerable than others. So it's a little bit more complex, I think, than we give credit to. That there are some layers to think about.
For sure. Well, I mean, frankly, that sounds a lot like alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really, because there's, genetic factors.
Yes.
There's social factors, familial factors,
Yep.
Personal vulnerabilities,
Yes.
access, all of these things, when you start using,
Mm-hmm.
developmentally.
Oh, yeah.
It sounds a lot like alcohol. So I don't know, do you use that kind of a comparison as you're talking to people?
Yeah. And I kind of like the idea of just talking about an addictive disorder that can manifest as behaviors or in substance use. I don't necessarily think it's really helpful to separate and make this hard distinction between chemical addiction and behavioral addictions, because it's impacting the same part of the brain. We take a biopsychosocial approach to both. There are very similar risk factors for both. And so some may choose to change the way that they feel and regulate their emotions through cannabis use, and others do that same thing by zoning out by gambling or gaming. And so I think it's rewarding either the drug of abuse or this behavior, and it's going to be it's positively and negatively reinforcing. So it's positively reinforcing in that it induces pleasure or feelings of excitement or a desirable sensation. It's negatively reinforcing because it takes away something undesirable like distress or depression or anxiety. Drugs of abuse can do that, and these potentially addictive behaviors can do that. So I think there's a lot of overlap, and everything that you're saying about alcohol that you just mentioned are things that we think about with behavioral addictions as well. We think of genetic predisposition, the environment that they're in and what they're exposed to, social learning. We look at whether or not they have a history of trauma and some other psychological risk factors, co-occurring mental health concerns. All of those things could increase the risk of a behavioral addiction or a substance use disorder.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of good literature out there now on the impact of adverse childhood experiences.
Yes.
You kind of reference trauma, but trauma is just one kind of aspect of the adverse childhood experiences. And so I think that speaks to some of the risk factors here as well, because what happens in those situations, right, is a disruption in their development for emotional regulation and being able to, like, at times socially connect or attach. And those seem to be big factors as well too. But
and if I could just add to,
go ahead.
Yeah, if I can add to that as well, the adverse childhood experience literature, I think, is just exploding right now. And what we're finding is the more ACEs or adverse childhood experiences that a person experiences in childhood, it correlates with substance use in adulthood, but it also correlates with number of sexual partners, obesity, and problematic gambling. So it's showing us that having maybe a dysregulated stress response due to ACEs in childhood can lead to coping and trying to regulate those heightened emotions from a dysregulated stress response through sexual activity, through zoning out by gambling, or even eating, and kind of getting the neurotransmitters that induce pleasure that come with eating can be another form of just regulating that stress response. So I think that the ACEs literature is really helping us see that connection to adult behavioral addictions.
Yeah, that's good. So I still have like this idea of a family in my head as we're talking about this, and like them trying to navigate, maybe a parent is listening to the podcast today and they're thinking about their 13 or 14-year-old daughter or son or something. And they're just kind of wondering, like, where do I start the conversation even about some of these? Because I mean, I don't think we're great socially at talking about some of these issues, like sex and like even, or substance use, or, maybe it's a little bit easier to talk about social media, but I don't know that parents are always modeling great stuff either. So I don't know, just where do you start in talking with parents or families to get these conversations going?
Yeah. I think being willing to have the conversation and being available for it is huge. Showing that you are interested in this activity that your youth is engaging in. But one of the things I think can be very helpful, and this is kind of from an Adlerian perspective, is asking, like, what does gaming do for you? Or what is the function of social media in your life? And if you can understand the motive for engaging in some of these behaviors, that can be really telling. That we have some people who, the literature on internet gaming disorder says that there are some who game because all their friends are doing it and they're bored and they want to jump in. And that's okay. But the motives that are most linked to internet gaming disorder are things like a desire to escape life and to kind of create a new life in the game. Or if someone doesn't feel adequate in their life. So maybe you have a teen who doesn't feel popular at school, maybe doesn't make the best grades, but in the game, they're respected, they achieve, they are able to level up rather quickly, they have a guild of people who are supporting them. Then if their motivation is to be successful and achieve in the game, that's more linked to internet gaming disorder than some of the other motives. So I think first, just saying, what do you like about gaming? Like, what does it do for you? When do you feel most pulled into gaming? And if you're finding that it's because I feel inadequate in my own life, or I just want to escape my depression or escape my anxiety or escape my social phobia, that's really helpful information, I think, for parents and guardians to say, okay, this is what this activity is doing for my child. It's reinforcing for them in some way. And it's important to figure out what that is. And you can do that with social media, with gaming, but also gambling. You mentioned at the very beginning that, especially in certain parts of the country, people are familiar with gambling. But with the rise of online gambling, and now we have 26 states with legal and live sports betting, it's something that all clinicians are going to need to know, like across the nation. And we see youth and adolescents getting involved in some of these gambling activities. There's also, loot boxes in games, which are very similar to gambling. And there's, access to pornography on the internet. So I think parents and guardians need to first be aware of what their children are engaged in, be aware of what those activities are, and then really come from a non-evaluative, non-shaming stance of just saying, what is it that you like about this activity and what does it do for you? And that can be a great starting point to then maybe assessing, are those 4 C's present? Is this something that the adolescent is saying, I've tried to cut back a little bit and I haven't been able to, or I find myself thinking about it all the time, or I've even, cut class to go do these things. And then that can be really helpful information, because there's a lot of resources that are available to folks with behavioral addictions, but people might not know that they exist or not know how to access them. So I think it's first understanding the maybe severity of the issue and then taking steps to get our loved ones connected to the resources they need.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah. So I'm wondering a little bit more too about, the parent that's trying to have that conversation. They're saying, okay, I'm concerned and I'm trying to be curious, but I think at least the adolescents that I've worked with are pretty perceptive of, like, when mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, when they're not approving of something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, sometimes I've just encouraged parents to just be honest about kind of what their thought is. Like, I don't really understand why you're gaming so much. And part of me thinks that's not okay. You're spending too much time on that. But I also know I need to understand where you're coming from and why this is important to you. Yeah. So I'm going to try and set those things aside so that I can just listen to you. And I think just by being honest at the beginning is a way to kind of diffuse some of that defensiveness that the adolescent is like, all this is going to be is you trying to put restrictions on my screen time or on my gaming time or something like that. And then there's not really much of a conversation.
Yeah. And that wouldn't be that uncommon, especially when we're talking about addiction. There tends to be if people are seeing this as my primary coping strategy, then they're not going to want to let go of it very easily, that there's a lot of trying to protect that activity. And I think it can be helpful to think about either your child or someone else's engagement in a behavioral addiction from that stages of change model of looking at, are they, in pre-contemplation where they're thinking, I don't have a problem. And so there are different ways we approach that than if someone's in contemplation where they're saying, yeah, okay, this might be an issue, but I'm not sure I want to change it yet. We're going to use different techniques. And that's where I think some basic understanding of motivational interviewing and a basic understanding of some of those techniques. But when we're talking about parents instead of clinicians, there, I think the most important part is developing that trusting relationship. And the example you just gave of saying, this is what I'm feeling, but I care enough about you to kind of put that aside a little bit and just open up the doors of communication. That can be wildly effective because you have this parent who's being attuned and available and responsive to their child. And so that can be, I think, very helpful. But I also, I think there may come a point where parents say, okay, we might need to get a family counselor or a professional involved to help with some of these dynamics. And that happens. There are, 12-step programs for behavioral addictions. There's residential and outpatient for behavioral addictions. There's teen group counseling options. So there's also professional resources if that's where it needs to go.
Yeah. And I love that too, because it's not saying parents, you have to do this all by yourself and figure it all out, but there are resources that are available to help you and wanting and willing to help you. That's sometimes, it depends upon the family, but that sometimes can be a hard ask, right? Is to say, okay, we're going to go and see this counselor or family therapist or something like that. Are there any, tips or encouragement you would give and just helping a family, navigate that transition of like, okay, we've tried working on this together and we're just not really getting any traction. So we need some outside input here.
Yeah. And this is on my mind because I just taught a lecture on addiction as a family disease and how if any member of the family system has addiction, whether chemical or behavioral, it's going to impact the whole system. And so I think, especially if we're talking about an adolescent, it could be helpful to offer family counseling as the start and not saying, you're the problem, I want you to go get counseling and then come back when you're fixed. But instead saying, this is something that is affecting all of us and we all want to learn and grow and, experience greater degrees of wellness. Why don't we go as a family and talk to someone about some of these things or bring someone in for a home visit for a family session? Because whether it's a behavioral addiction or chemical addiction, it's going to impact those family relationships. And so Patrick Carnes is the big name associated with sex addiction. And his partner also does some writing about how sex addiction impacts spouses and partners. There's also books about how a parent's sex addiction can impact a child, and especially if a child finds out about parent sex addiction. So it's definitely this systems approach to how one member's addiction can impact that whole family. And so I think taking we're in this together, let's go see if we can work with a professional and get some help can be a great starting place.
Awesome. Yeah, that really resonates with me for sure. All right. I want to segue a little bit here into just returning to that topic of emotional regulation, because I think you've used that term, I've used that term, but it is a little bit of counseling jargon. So I want to just simplify and kind of speak plainly about that. Like, what are you talking about when you think of emotional regulation and associations with addiction? What are some of the things that come to your mind?
So in my mind, emotion regulation is the ability to influence your emotions, either to increase the experience of an emotion or decrease the experience of an emotion, to kind of put limits on emotions or to be able to modulate them in some way that is going to be helpful for the individual. So being able to identify and label and express emotions appropriately. And we know that that happens in those first few years of life through attunement with a primary caregiver and the attachment process. There's that co-regulation of emotion that takes place where infants and children learn how to regulate their own emotional states. We also know that not everyone learns that's a skill that people learn to various degrees in their family of origin. And for those who have deficits in emotion regulation, that is a very strong predictor of a lot of addictive behaviors. And it makes sense because addictive behaviors have almost instantaneous mood altering and gratifying properties. So if I'm feeling bad and then I look at pornography and then I don't feel bad anymore, or if I just want to feel good, so I game and I feel good, that's so it makes sense that there's such a connection between emotion regulation and addictive behaviors. One of the things I'm very passionate about is I feel like one of the best forms of prevention that we could devote our time and energy and finances into would be training young children in emotion regulation skills in the school system or in youth groups or faith communities so that they get a chance to continue to develop those skills, because we know that that can be a protective factor against addiction later. Not all of it, and there are other risk factors of addiction as well, but in a lot of the research across addictions, you see that emotion regulation deficits is a significant predictor to addictive behaviors. And so I think emotion regulation could be a key prevention avenue for us as we look at maybe trying to stop addictions before they start.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, yeah. I love that. I do. I mean, it's something that I've thought about a ton. You know, when I was back in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, working for the hospital system, I did have some folks that I was supervising that weren't part of the hospital system, and one of them was she's a school counselor. She's getting her LPC, and so still coming in for clinical supervision. But that was one of the big things that we talked about, was like, what an opportunity she had. You know, sometimes she would lament, oh, I don't get to see the kids as much as I want to because I'm doing all these other things. And I said, well, yeah, but look at what you're doing on the prevention side, because she was, you know, creating lessons and going into classrooms. And it was all, a lot of it was focused on emotion regulation, just teaching some of these skills. Like, how do I get my body to relax when I'm really stressed out or I'm tense or something is bothering me?
Yeah.
How do I communicate what I'm feeling? I see there being such a need and plenty of opportunities, but it doesn't seem like we're there yet, Amanda, where we're actively integrating this. Where, like, if you had a school and you were working with them, where would they start? You know, what kind of stuff would you implement in that setting?
Yeah, I think I would start as young as I possibly could. And I would, exactly what you're saying is, you know, how do I identify what I'm feeling in my body, and how do I engage in successful attempts to soothe myself if I'm feeling angry or depressed, and how do I comfort myself? And if I am unsuccessful, how do I reach out to a supportive person to find the comfort and the help that I need? Those things that, again, some people just get in their family of origin, but not everyone does. And that's where I think in a school system, starting very young, of just, let's, you know, identify emotions, let's name where they are in our bodies, and then let's start implementing emotion regulation strategies. So can I self-soothe? Can I distract myself? Can I turn my attention towards something else? Can I reframe what I'm experiencing? So there's lots and lots of ways to regulate emotions or cope with life's adversities. And I think if that was infused into curriculum, you know, starting in pre-K and then just continuing and getting more and more advanced and complex, that we know that there are some cognitive emotion regulation skills that aren't going to be appropriate until they're, you know, older and in, you know, they have more development. And so even just starting with things like reaching out for support, asking for help and distraction, and then moving into other ways to self-soothe. I'm thinking about some research that we did recently on non-suicidal self-injury. And if you look at the data around non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI, the primary motivation for engaging in that self-harm is emotion regulation. That there's some who engage in it for self-punishment or anti-dissociation, and some who engage as a way to communicate their pain to another person. But in the data that we have, one of the primary motivations for NSSI among adolescents continues to be to change the way I feel, to stop feeling bad, or to feel good. And so I think we can apply that, to any potentially addictive behavior. Of if we had other options and other tools in their toolbox, then altering their mood through some of these potentially addictive behaviors wouldn't be so appealing, because they have these other tools that they can use. So I would say, let's start as young as we can and just infuse it in the curriculum throughout.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Amen. Well, and I think because when kids don't know what to do, or teens don't know what to do, like, we try and figure it out. And sometimes that's trial and error. And other times, I don't know about you, but if I've got something weird going on, I'm gonna go online and look it up and try and see, well, what can I find out about this? And I think, again, just circling back to like online access, social media, those kind of things, lots of these behaviors get demonstrated and depicted in social media. And so then I've had plenty of clients that are like, well, I saw it, so then I tried it. And it's not just a void that doesn't get filled, right? When you lack knowledge, it's going to get filled with something. Yeah.
And we even, average age of first engagement in NSSI is around 12 or 12 and a half years old, but average age of first exposure to NSSI is around 10 and up to 11. And so they're seeing it in on social media or in movies first, and then moving into trying it themselves.
Yeah. So, all right, segue again, because we've been spending a lot of time talking about kids, teens, and that's because I love that kind of topic. That's really important to me. I've got kids of my own in all of those age ranges right now, so that's just on my mind. But I want to talk about adults here too. And, I think there are plenty of adults that maybe have had some of these patterns in their life for a long time, whether that's pornography use or addiction, gaming, anything that we've talked about at this point. And, I've had folks that, describe kind of seasons of their life where they feel a sense of success or kind of victory over this thing. And then other seasons of life where they feel very much, kind of owned by or oppressed by this behavior. So, I don't know. First of all, how common is that? I mean, is it just like I'm in it and I'm just in it forever, or are these kind of this idea of waves of engagement? Is that more active?
Yeah. So rather than waves, what comes to mind as you're speaking to me is relapse, and that is very common in all addictive behaviors. But when we're thinking about, and if I could take a moment here just to clarify, I get this question a lot is, so what does recovery or absence look like for a behavioral addiction? Because it kind of makes sense with alcohol and drugs, just don't use them. But what does it look like for food addiction, sex addiction, and anything that's related to the internet? Because we're not able to survive without some internet use. So one of the tools that we use in the behavioral addictions field, it's called the 3 circles technique, and they use this a lot in 12-step programs. They sit down with a sponsor and they talk about, they have 3 concentric circles, and the innermost circle, they say, what are those compulsive, out of control behaviors that are leading to negative consequences? And that's what they identify in their innermost circle. Those are going to be the behaviors that they're going to abstain from. That they say, I'm living in recovery. That means I'm not engaging in these inner circle behaviors. The middle circle are warning signs that they might be getting close to those inner circle behaviors. So if an inner circle behavior for someone is using pornography or anonymous sex with adults, The middle circle behavior may be things like being seductive with someone, or flirting with someone, or watching a sex scene in a movie. The things that mean I might be getting close to my inner circle behaviors. I haven't technically relapsed, but I'm getting closer to that. And then the outer circle, that represents really healthy behaviors, things that are appropriate, things that help, are aligned with their goals and values, and that they're encouraged to engage in. So when you're talking about kind of these waves or seasons, I'm hearing it as when people abstain from those inner circle behaviors and they embark upon recovery. Just like with chemical addiction, we know that people tend to recycle back through the stages of change. They don't get to that maintenance stage and stay there forever. Some people do, and that's great. In 12-step circles, they call them like one-shot wonders and things, but that's atypical. The more typical experience is I'm abstaining, I'm in recovery, and then life changes a little bit, or I get tossed a curveball, or I'm now faced with loss, and I didn't kind of plan for this in my recovery plan. And so I may revert back to old behavior, which is all that a relapse is. And then we have to kind of adjust. So now let's come up with a new recovery plan. Let's now try to get back to that place of abstaining from those inner circle behaviors. And that can take a long time, especially for folks who started using pornography when they were 14, and now they are in their 30s, and maybe they're experiencing sexual dysfunction, or they're not experiencing arousal with their significant other anymore. That can take a long time to reach sustained abstinence and recovery if they've been engaging in this behavior for over a decade. And so I think there also has to be a little bit of grace and compassion. Especially I talk to family members sometimes that say, okay, he, stopped using or she stopped using pornography on a Thursday and it's Sunday and we're still struggling. And I'm like, right. Patrick Carnes said that sex addiction can take 2 to 3 years to get to sustained recovery. So I think we have to be a little bit more, provide more psychoeducation about that process, and then continue to build in that support system to help people reach their recovery goals.
Absolutely. Yeah. I like that, the 3 circles technique that you were just talking about, that really helps conceptualize it for me. And it is a new way. And I'm sure, like you said, all of these things have been around for a while and it's just adapting them, but that's a new way for me to think about it. When I've walked through, a relapse prevention plan with somebody, that's struggling with some sort of behavioral addiction, the very kind of first thing that we're doing in developing that is the self-monitoring piece of what's in that middle circle, of kind of like risks or warnings, or I'll use the term triggers, that kind of pave the way for me to go back into or relapse back into those old behaviors. Right. So that, I don't know, I'm definitely going to take that and use that. I'll cite you, Amanda, for sure.
Well, a lot of this comes from out of the 12-step programs. We have 4 different 12-step programs for sex addiction. And I think that also just gives credence to how prevalent this is in our society. But when I was writing my book, I got to speak to a member from each, and they either call it the 3 circles technique or top lines, middle lines, and bottom lines. And it's the same thing. It's of saying, what are those things we're going to abstain from? And then what are the warning signs or the triggers that might indicate we are moving in the direction of a relapse? And as I'm sure you know from your own work, that relapse starts well before engaging in a behavior. I mean, there are thoughts and emotions that precede that. And so as we work with clients in particular, who maybe have experienced a relapse, that's a great learning activity to say, let's go back and kind of start this chain way back here from that first thought, and then engage in chain analysis and kind of see where we can strengthen our recovery plan. So I think the 12-step programs is where I got a lot of this information as well. And I think they're doing some pretty great work.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is. And I like that too, because it's not just addressing that middle circle piece of specific behaviors that pave it, but it's also getting into where the vulnerabilities are. So whether that's with my mood state, whether that's in an important primary relationship, my work life, or something, there are these contextual factors that then when something is off there or it's going, poorly or whatever, that creates a vulnerability for us to try and regulate emotion, right? That's what we're going to try and do. But then we do that by kind of these old habits or these old patterns that we can quickly kind of go back to, unless we're, again, doing the work of the, top line, middle line, bottom line, or the three circles or whatever.
Yeah. And it sounds like you're describing Gorski's CNEPS model of relapse prevention, where you identify those warning signs. And then part of the work is, so what am I going to do when that event happens, when that, high risk situation, and I'm kind of blending now Marlotte's model too, but when you have a high risk situation or a warning sign, I think our clients and, our loved ones need an option. And right now, their addictive behavior has been their option of how I'm going to cope and how I'm going to regulate emotions. So if we can help provide other options, so other coping strategies and other emotion regulation strategies, that's really, I think, one of the key components of relapse prevention counseling is making sure they have other tools in their toolbox so they don't revert back to that one tool that worked for them for a decade.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. And I love that you took my waves question initially and understood it intuitively. What I was hoping for us to talk about was recovery, because even though it's not, with substance use, it's not just don't use it, don't just do it anymore. It's much more than that. But that clearly doesn't apply when, my addiction is based on my cell phone. Or something. It's okay. Yep. But there are probably, I don't know what, I want to pick your brain, and I know we're getting close to our time here, so I want to be cognizant of that. But this is also something that was kind of percolating for me. At times, I've had clients that will say, I am gonna stop. Like, I just won't use this. So if it is like, say they've been using pornography and they're the only time that they're accessing it literally is on their phone or something, that they will just say, I'm not going to have a phone, or I'm going to have like one of the track phones, that I just have some minutes for texting and calling on or something like that. Yeah. And, again, that's a choice that they're making to do that. And I think that some folks will maybe do that indefinitely, but others are kind of looking at that as like a short-term kind of mechanism. And, so, what are your thoughts on kind of that cold turkey aspect of like, I'm just not going to do this thing anymore, and, take it away completely as a pathway into recovery?
Yeah. So my response to that would be a little bit of like, when I get that question, I like to lead the conversation back to the brain, because I think that helps make a lot of this make sense. That if we are engaging in a very rewarding behavior like pornography use, or even checking social media to see if we have a new notification, when we see that little symbol that says notification, we get a little bit of dopamine. We say, oh, that's reinforcing, that feels good, that's rewarding. When we overstimulate our reward pathway and we have these elevated levels of dopamine over time, our brain starts to adapt to that. And these are called neuroadaptations, that it could be that the brain starts to downregulate the dopamine system because there's so much of it. And so that could be decreasing dopamine transporters or receptors, or just the natural production of dopamine. So things are happening in the brain in response to this chronic engagement with the reward system through pornography use or some of these other, what they're called supernormal stimulus, that they are very rewarding and they're artificial exaggerations of natural rewards. So when that happens, and then someone says, okay, I've experienced negative consequences in my life. I see that I've lost control of my behavior. It's not in line with my goals and values. So I want to abstain and I want to make some changes. there actually needs to be a period where the brain can kind of heal or return back to baseline after those neuroadaptations have taken place. So with things like pornography and sex addiction, it's recommended that there's 90 days with no sexual stimulation, just to give the brain a chance to kind of calm down, come back to baseline, and start to resume functioning as it did before the behavioral addiction was present. And so that has been helpful, I think, for families to learn that this is not just a moral failing. This isn't just a character flaw, or this person is a bad person. This is a brain issue, and that's why I love ASAM's definition of addiction. Really talks about this is a brain disease. There's biological and genetic components to it. So if your brain has adapted over time because of chronic stimulation of the reward pathway, that's going to take a little while to reverse and to get back to how the brain was operating before the behavioral addiction. So I would say, yes, in most cases, there needs to be some kind of period of complete abstinence, either from the addictive behavior or triggers of that addictive behavior. And that's the other thing that I think is very helpful to educate folks, that if I have paired pornography use with a certain room in my house or with a certain device over and over and over, that pairing is now a cue. So my brain sees that thing I've paired it with, and I get a little spike of dopamine saying, oh, it's coming. It's starting to anticipate, because our brains are very sophisticated. So now we get almost a little dopamine hit from the cues that we have paired with that addictive behavior. So it's helpful for the first 90 days or so to make sure you're not around those triggers, that you've removed as many from your household as you can, that you're very aware of what those cues are, and you have plans in place of what am I going to do if I am triggered, or if I do see a cue and I get a small urge to engage. What am I going to do to kind of ride out that wave, or get through that craving period? So there's a lot that goes into the recovery process that I think can be very what's empowering for people to learn. Like, this is what's happening in your brain, and this is what we can be doing to ensure that you have success. Because people can get really discouraged if they've, abstained for a week and they're still craving or they're still struggling. And that's very typical. And so I think the more we can educate about what's going on in the brain, the less it becomes about like a morality issue, and the more it is a science issue of let your brain kind of heal and go back to baseline without these stimulating activities. And then we kind of start from there. Yeah. I don't even know if that answered what you were.
No,
I think I was all over the place.
Totally does. It totally does. But no, but it the same thing applies for NSSA or that like anybody that I've worked with over the years that engages in injurious behavior, they kind of have a preferred method and a preferred, frankly, tool for doing that too. So part of that is just getting rid of that tool, getting rid of the thing that they've been using because they've made that association or attachment to it.
Yep. Yes, definitely. And so that applies to almost any addiction. That what are those things that we've paired with the addictive behaviors? And even so, I've had clients who had using dreams or have dreams where they've engaged in their addictive behavior, and they can wake up in a craving state. And so just having a plan in place for how are we going to deal with those cravings, there's a lot of shame around them as well. And so I think there's such a need for education around how, your brain is anticipating this form of reward that it's been used to for many, many years. And so these things shouldn't surprise us. And it's not a source of shame. It's part of this disorder and something that we're going to work through in recovery.
Thank you so much for saying that, Amanda. And I almost feel bad that it took us this whole time to get to this point where we're saying it's not about shaming people. It's understanding like there's a biological process that's happening here. Associated with our brain and our physiology. And we need to honor that and recognize that this isn't about a defect of character, as you put it. This isn't about being a bad person or having some moral failing or something like that. That really, that there is such a strong physiological process at work here, that it's only with intentional focus and effort and support will a person move into that recovery phase and be able to address, lapses and relapses.
Yep. And that's something I teach my students right off the bat. I tell them that my addictions course is really just all about building empathy, because we know empathy is such a predictor of positive clinical outcomes. But one of the things that helps them really have empathy for folks with behavioral addictions is we explain that the risk factors that make certain individuals more susceptible than others, which can be early trauma or genetic predispositions or mental health concerns or certain psychological traits. And so I explain how, one person can game and say, okay, that was fine. I could take it or leave it. It was all right. And then another person, just based on how their reward system is wired and how their neurotransmitter levels and things like that, they could game and say, this is the best I've ever felt. Like, this is giving me something I feel like I've been missing my whole life. And it is extremely hard to walk away from. And so that's something I try to help students just develop empathy, that degree of euphoria or positive reinforcement can vary from person to person based on their genetics and their past history. And so just to say, I don't have a problem with gaming, so you shouldn't either, that's not helpful. Instead, we think everyone's experience is different. And one person's level of euphoria in response to a potentially addictive behavior can be so much higher than another person's based on things that they can't control. And so I think that just helps us all have a little bit less of the moral model of addiction, which we know is not helpful, but still very prevalent, and have that biopsychosocial perspective.
Cool. All right. So I've got one more question for you, and this is just a personal one here.
Okay.
So I'm a runner, and it's something that I've been doing for a long time, and I enjoy it. And I run kind of stupid long distances sometimes. Like people are like, "What? Are you serious?" Yeah. Okay. But within the running community, especially kind of the ultra long distance running community, there is a strong concentration of people in recovery in that community. And this is just anecdotal. I've heard plenty of people in that running community kind of say, well, it's almost like swapping out addiction. I was doing this thing and it was, compulsive, and I didn't have any control over it, and I had all these consequences, and I hit all the 4 C's. But now, part of my recovery is that I'm running, and they run a lot and often and those kind of things. And so I'm just wondering if in your research or in the literature that you've been reviewing, does that hold up where people in recovery kind of find these other outlets, maybe even specifically physical outlets that are kind of extreme? Or could be perceived as extreme by some people. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
There's quite a debate out there about, so Glasser with reality therapy, he introduced this idea of positive addictions. And so are we just moving from one addiction to another, but he called them positive addictions. There's a lot of debate, and another example I've heard, because I think running and physical activity is a replacement behavior for a lot of addictive behavior. So that is very common. Also 12-step meetings. So I've had people say, well, now I'm not addicted to this, but I feel like I'm addicted to meetings because I have to go to one every day to stay sober. And now I just do that instead. And I think that's where the term addiction might not be helpful to just throw around with anything that we do regularly. That doesn't necessarily make it an addiction. There are, with addictive behaviors, the hallmarks in the substance use disorder criteria in the DSM and other places is that it causes impairment, it causes significant distress, and there are negative consequences. So if someone's running long distances and they are using that as a means to kind of regulate their emotions and give themselves a coping strategy, it doesn't sound like impairment and significant distress and negative consequences to me. And so I wouldn't use that same word addiction for both of those things. There is a program, I show a TED Talk in my class about how, along with counseling and 12-step groups, they offer physical sports as a way to help people overcome their addiction. And there's a lot of biology in that. It's we're getting our blood pumping, and we're getting an endorphin release, and we're kind of finding natural rewards through the socialization and the achievement and the physical activity. And so it it became people's sole almost replacement behavior to go through recovery. They would engage in these extreme sports. Again, I don't think that meets the same criteria as addiction. So I don't think it's replacing one addiction with another. I think it's saying, I'm wired this particular way. Perhaps I had some genetic vulnerabilities that made me more susceptible to addiction, but instead I'm going to kind of channel them differently and meet my needs in another way that is not impairing and not full of distress and doesn't lead to negative consequences. And if that's running for really, really long distances, I think that that could be seen as, wow, you really that's a wise decision in your life, that you are trying to find another way to navigate life's adversities and kind of manage your emotional state. So that's my thought on that. But there's a lot of people who say quite a bit. So yeah. Well,
and that's, I mean, kind of bringing your expertise in here. I just wanted to ask that question. So all my fellow runners out there, just keep running. Just keep running.
And you can also read about exercise addiction. I have a chapter of that in the book because that's another form of behavioral addiction but you're definitely going to see those 4 C's present for it to meet criteria for exercise addiction.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So your book, I understand, is primarily focused probably on people training to be helpers. Is that fair to say?
Yep. So it's for any mental health professional to learn about behavioral addictions, how to conceptualize, assess, and treat them.
Okay. And the title is?
A Clinical Guide to Treating Behavioral Addictions.
Awesome. So I'll put a link in the show notes for that. So anybody out there that's in a helping role or wants to know kind of more about that from a treatment and a science perspective can access that. However, if you're not interested in that level, but want some really good kind of concise and precise articles and insights, where can people find some of the blog posts and articles that you're writing?
Yeah, so I write for Psychology Today. The blog is called Understanding Addiction. So that is a resource, but also I have a Facebook page. It's my author page. So it's facebook.com/Amanda Lee Giordano. So it's Lee and then Giordano. And on that site, I try to compile as many resources as I can about behavioral addiction. So I have videos and webinars and blogs and just all sorts of things there. So if people are interested, there's a lot of free content on there as well.
Fantastic. I will link both of those in the show notes as well. Boy, it's just been so fun getting to talk with you, Amanda. I'm
Thanks
wondering,
for having me.
With getting your book published and doing all that work, I mean, do you have a new project that you're working on already, or are you just trying to catch your breath after finishing that one?
No, I think it's been so well received that I keep hearing from clinicians like, thank you so much for putting resources out there, because I'm just kind of scrambling. I'm learning on the job. I'm trying to find as much as I can about these issues. So I feel very dedicated right now to getting information out to the public in easily digestible forms like podcasts and blogs and webinars and training videos. So that's what I've been spending my time on lately, of just trying to raise general public awareness about behavioral addictions, along with, our scientific journal articles. I think those are great, but we also need to get, I think, information out to the masses too. So that's why I've been focused on trying to just speak and write as much as I can.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I really appreciate it. And that's a big part of this podcast too, is bringing those things into the public domain, into people's day-to-day conversation, so they can say, hey, I was just listening to Amanda on the Well Mind, and, be able to have those kind of conversations with their partner, with their coworkers, wherever they might be.
Exactly.
So I really appreciate that. I think that's an important responsibility that we have.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your interest in the topic. I think that that's very helpful to have people with a platform to say, we want to use our platform to kind of raise awareness specifically around addiction. So thanks for that. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you for being here. It's been, just fantastic. And I look forward to reading future articles from you and future insights and all that sort of good stuff.
That sounds good. Thank you so much.
A big thank you to Dr. Giordano for joining the WellMind community, and thank you for spending your time with me today. If you enjoyed my conversation with Amanda, please check out previous episodes. Click, rate, subscribe through your podcast app so you get the latest episodes. Let people know about the WellMind podcast and talk with others about what you heard today. Please check out the links in the show notes for a link to Amanda's new book and the wonderful resources she has on her Facebook page and the articles in Psychology Today. Many thanks to the staff here in the Bethany Lutheran College podcast studio. Seth and Greg are tremendous in providing technical support and editing for the podcast. Special thanks to Lauren McMacken for designing the logo and cover art. So thanks again for listening, and until next time, be well.